I worked on Her Majesty's Secret Service, a film with George Lazenby as James Bond and Diana Rigg as his wife. My name is Drummond Riddell. I was born in Scotland, and I was an avid film goer from the age of 3. My parents used to take me to movies. Then I went when I was getting older, and I attended all kinds of films. I was crazy about films. I determined that I would work in the film world. And I started when I was drafted into the Royal Air Force years after the Second War. I painted the sets for the officers' plays. I graduated school at 14, so did my whole class, and I got outstanding prizes at art and writing. I graduated from school at 14, so did my whole class that was in Scotland, and I had won all the prizes for art, drawing, and English, composition, etc. And then I was drafted into the Royal Air Force some years after the war, and I began, I suppose, my theatrical career there because the officers put on plays, and I painted the sets for the plays. When I came out of the Air Force, I emigrated to Canada, and when television opened, I was a scenic artist there for a year and a half. Then I went back to England, and I became a scenic artist at the Old Vic Theatre, Shakespeare, in London. And then I became an actor, which I had done a bit before in Canada, and toured with Sarah Churchill, the daughter of Winston Churchill. And that led me to The Sound of Music in London, various things. I was a friend of Jeff Bernard. Nobody knows Jeff Bernard, but he was a stagehand. At the Old Vic Theatre, I met a fellow called Jeff Bernard, who was a stagehand. Later on, he became quite a renowned writer. He was a sports writer and so forth and so on. He was such an extraordinary character and met all the interesting people in London that after he died a few years ago, he was played on the stage by Peter O'Toole, and a very successful play. He was quite a character. The title is Geoffrey Bernard is Unwell, and it's well worth reading. It's extremely funny. In Canada, I attended the festival. It was the second festival of Ontario, and Tyrone Guthrie was directing James Mason in Oedipus Rex. I met James Mason there, and William Shatner, who's now very famous, at that time was, so to speak, carrying a spear, and he actually married the receptionist who was in the television station. That was the first opening of television where I was a scenic artist. And then I went back to London, worked at the Old Vic as a scenic artist, and in the Coach and Horses in Greek Street, close to Cambridge Circus, Jeff Bernard's cartoons were all over the place. They were everywhere, and he became quite famous. As it happens, he was alcoholic. Everybody liked him, but he died around 1989, and Peter O'Toole later on played him on the stage. Jeffrey Bernard is unwell. That time I toured as an actor, 1961, with Sarah Churchill in her own company. I was a stage manager and stand-in for the lead. And then I went to Sound of Music for 2 years in London. A smash hit show. Ran for 7 years, packed houses every night. But I wasn't there all that time. I was on the stage with Alec Guinness when he played Lawrence of Arabia. The title of the play was Ross by Terence Rattigan. In my opinion, the last of the great playwrights. This is 1963.
Go.
This is 1963. I'm in front of my portrait of Rabindranath Tagore, which is just above my head. The one on the left is Tom Bell, the actor. There's the old Vic insignia below, and below that is a photograph of the card sent to me by Noel Coward from Jamaica. He's sitting in a throne chair with two wings on the wall behind him, as if they're coming out of his shoulders. And this is Hitchcock with his dummy. The dummy is the person behind him. He's pointing at his dummy. This was at County Hall in London by the river, and he had this strange idea that he might photograph his dummy floating down the river at the end of the film. The film was Frenzy. I can be seen just above the dummy, or parallel to, in the extreme right. And this is the opening scene in which a strange body is found in the water, and it's a naked girl with a tie around her neck. That starts off the film. Frenzy, 1971, London. This is another angle, Hitchcock with his dummy behind him, and I'm just there on the right behind the dummy, arrow pointing to my head. This is Josephine Blake. She was a star of cabaret and theatre, singing and dancing, and she signed her photograph to me. I used to stage manage the nightclub after the theatre. It was the Lirondelle, which means the swallow, in Swallow Street, just off Shaftesbury Avenue. Jo Blake, very powerful voice. She did an imitation of Sophie Tucker, and I discovered Sophie Tucker was in London, and I phoned Sophie Tucker and suggested that she might come and listen to her. I don't know whether she ever did. I never saw her in the nightclub, but I tried. In 1968, I was working with Peter Cushing, the well-known horror film star and Shakespearean actor, on the film called Death's Head Vampire. It went out on a double bill with Witchfinder General, which in the United States became The Conqueror Worm. And this is a photograph you're about to see of myself with the leading lady. This is the leading lady, Wanda Ventum, standing beside me in an archway of a very old mansion. It was filmed, well, the period was around 1895. Very beautiful girl. Gilbert and Sullivan wrote all the operettas. The place that we were doing the Peter Cushing film was the old house of Gilbert, and mysteriously he drowned in 2 feet of water in a pool. But he was supposed to be haunting the place, and there was a musician's gallery inside the house. When we were doing night shooting, Wanda's boyfriend was downstairs and I was up in the musician's gallery with Wanda and pretending to be making love to her, and the boyfriend was too scared to come up in case he met the ghost. We chased the ghost away. How's that? This is my photograph with Peter Cushing on the film that we made together, Death's Head Vampire. He was pointing to the script and saying, "What, that bloody thing?" And just at that moment the photograph was taken. This is Peter pointing to the script which I have in my hand and saying, "What, that bloody thing?" And at that moment the photograph was taken. It was quite amusing because Peter Cushing went to bed every night at 10 o'clock, and at nearly 10 o'clock we were on night shooting. Peter was sitting in a coach, and right beside him the director, an old school English type of fellow, was saying, "Now we've got to get a shot of Cushing coming out of the house and going into the coach. Then we've got to get another shot of Cushing inside the coach." And Peter Cushing was sitting right there on the coach listening to all this. Instead of saying Peter, he kept saying, "Get a shot of Cushing." I worked on Assassination Bureau with Diana Rigg and Oliver Reed, and a big film. Telly Savalas was the villain, as I recall. And at one point, the first assistant director said to the director, Basil Dearden, "Basil, what maniac in Hollywood would write a check for £1 million to put Diana Rigg, a very modern type, in a Victorian melodrama like this?" And Basil said, "She's so popular in America," that was because of the Avengers television series, "they think they'll get the money back very quickly." In fact, the film was not successful. Michael Horton, yeah, that's right. This is a very beautiful American actress named Rochelle Hudson. I never had the pleasure of meeting her, but I used to correspond with her while I was in England. And I came here for a month in end of '71, and it turned out that her husband had died 2 weeks before, and she had died 1 week before I got here, so I never actually met her. And that was rather tragic. It sounded to me as if she couldn't live without him or something. I suspected that it might be a suicide. This is a prima ballerina, Ludmila Cherina. She was a top ballet dancer. She appeared in the films The Red Shoes and The Tales of Hoffmann. A very sexy performance in The Tales of Hoffmann. She was in the scene in Venice. In 1968, I was working on Oh, What a Lovely War, the first film directed by Richard Attenborough, who was a renowned actor of well over 20 years. And everyone was in it. That's to say, Olivier, Ralph Richardson, John Gielgud, John Mills, Doug Bogard, Susanna York, and Jane Seymour turned up as one of the chorus girls. I was in charge of the chorus girls in a small hotel, and she married Richard Attenborough's son. and from then on her career was more or less launched. Jane Seymour, everybody knows who she is. This is me on the right with Richard Attenborough on the left. That was the night in the Beverly Hills Hotel before Dickie Attenborough received all the Academy Awards for Gandhi. And I said to him, how does it feel to be Sir Richard? He said, oh, all right, you know. But like most actors in England, he is something of a socialist. So, but now he's 83 and in the House of Lords, Lord Attenborough. I had a photograph of him dancing through the tulips with Princess Diana. He actually made a film on Diana. This is Hazel Court. She was in a Frankenstein movie with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. And she also co-starred with Vincent Price in the best film Roger Corman ever made, in my opinion, The Mask of the Red Death. Grace Kelly, Princess Grace, who was introduced to me by Cary Grant. Princess Grace of Monaco, Grace Kelly, who was introduced to me by Cary Grant. Last time I saw her was 1967 outside the Hilton Hotel in London, and there was a nice little coffee shop nearby. I persuaded her to come with me, and we lost her entourage for a while. That's the last time I ever saw her. I worked on Her Majesty's Secret Service, a film with George Lazenby as James Bond and Diana Rigg as his wife. And he was an Australian, and he did a very good job. And when he went to the heraldry, the place where they have the coats of arms and so forth, he met a man there, and he was supposed to be that man when he went to Switzerland to visit Telly Savalas. And that man dubbed his voice all the way through from then on. That was George Baker, the actor. Telly Savalas was the villain, Blofeld. I was on a film in 1967 with George Segal, Ursula Andress, and I had the distinction, I suppose, of writing two scenes with Orson Welles, who was also in the picture. The director was Sidney Hayers. He was not pleased with two scenes, asked me to look them over. I started rewriting them by hand. Orson Welles happened to walk by, took them away, rewrote them, and kept a lot of my dialogue in the scenes. And I was pleased about that. But so I suppose I could say that I wrote two scenes of a film with the great Orson Welles. In that same film, there's a scene in Africa where Ursula Andress, was naked in a pool. She came out and there was a snake there, but they had to do the rest of the thing in pine wood, and it was getting very cold, late autumn, and she was very cold, and I was standing at the top of this little hill with several large towels. She kept shouting my name and shivering, and when she'd finished, she came running out about 7 times, and I wrapped her in a towel 7 times. The naked Ursula Andress. What an experience. In the 60s, I worked with Peter Sellers, writing a script, my idea, and it was never finished because Peter was always going off to premieres and so on and so forth. He actually enhanced his career because he was such a tremendous impersonator that he would meet a producer one night and he would remember his voice, call up another producer who was in film and say in the producer's voice, this is so-and-so. You must go and see Peter Sellers, this great comedian, at such and such a club. That was one of the tricks he used in order to get his career going. That was in London in the 50s.
Ready?
Yeah. Met Sean Connery in the King's Road, Chelsea in the 1960s. I walked down the street with him, and he asked me about Thunderball. How did I like it? And I said, well, if you remember From Russia with Love, you were very vulnerable in that. Robert Shaw had you at gunpoint, and he made you crawl across the floor and so forth. In Thunderball, you seemed to turn into a Superman, flying in the air and so forth. And it was a good film. I have a copy. But anyway, he was of something of the same opinion, although he did make a couple of Bond films after that. But in the interim, that's when George Lazenby stepped in, for one picture only, on Her Majesty's Secret Service. In 1967, there was a dispute with a large company and our union. So we were marching, led by Diana Rigg, through the streets of Soho. And on a street corner, coincidentally, there happened to be a woman called Honor Blackman. And she preceded Diana in the series of The Avengers. And so the two of them met, and that was very nice. My first assistant, George Pollard, knew both of them very well. He went over and talked to them. And that was, she actually instigated Wait Until Dark. I believe she was 41 at the time. I'm speaking of Honor Blackman now, on the stage. She was 41 and she looked about 19. That's about the blind girl, of the people coming visiting her, trying to get opium out of a doll or something. The film was made with Audrey Hepburn. Honor Blackman played Pussy Galore in the film of Goldfinger with Sean Connery as James Bond. In 1962, the Conservative government was brought down by a girl named Christine Keeler, who had been met by the War Minister, John Profumo, at Cliveden, the estate of Lord Astor. He was in the company of Douglas Fairbanks and Lord Astor, walking one evening, and there were several naked young girls in the pool. Anyway, he was introduced to them. He had an affair with her. I'm speaking of Profumo, the War Minister. And unknown to him, she was sleeping at the same time with a Russian envoy. I can't recall his name. And this blew up. The whole scandal came about because of Christine Keeler. Her friend was Mandy Rice Davis, and there was a film about it called Scandal, with John Hurt as the man who introduced all of the people concerned. That would come out about 1979, I think. Scandal. Bridget Fonda. John Profumo at that time was married to Valerie Hobson, who was a well-known film star, especially in British films, and the scandal broke. He had to resign. He was Italian, very rich. For the rest of his life, he devoted himself to charities. Lived in one of the poorest sections of London, if you could call them poor nowadays, and he worked purely for charity the rest of his life. For the benefit of film scholars and students, Valerie Hobson starred with Roger Livesey and Sabu in a Technicolor movie called The Drum, 1938, and she played the grown-up Estella in David Lean's version of Great Expectations with John Mills. I worked for 2 episodes on a television series called The Champions with a young woman named Alex Vasteda. She was the leading lady, one of the most beautiful girls I have ever seen. Skin like gold. Her features looked as though they had been carved out of porcelain. I'll never forget her. I don't even have a photograph of her, but she was certainly one of the most beautiful women that I have ever seen. Alex Vasteda. In the 1960s, in my view, the political situation was this. The class structure started disintegrating very quickly, especially, oddly enough, with the advent of the Beatles. It was the Beatles that began the whole thing. They started the entire psychedelic, so to speak, business of all kinds of businesses. There was a market in the middle of Piccadilly called I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet, and all kinds of things started changing in the 1960s. The interesting thing in the 1950s was that men who were earning £10 a week and raising children from that would buy flags and go stand in the parade and wait till the Queen's coach went by, waved their flags and so forth, and it never occurred to them that the Queen at that time, from only a few of her overseas investments, had an income of £150 million a day. So that was an interesting contrast. But in the 1960s, everything started coming apart, you could say, and then coming together again. It was a great time to be in London, and I was there mostly through the 1960s, apart from a few months in California. I came over here to visit a person I had seen his name in Variety, and he came from near my place in Scotland. I'd never met him, but he had the same name. And I emigrated over here briefly, and we met. His name was James Riddell. He was the vice president of ABC television here in Hollywood. And later on, when I worked on the stage with Howard Keel, I used to draw Howard Keel while he was on the stage. And he saw my signature. He said, "Do you know James Riddell?" I said, "Yes, I know him. I've been over there and met him." He said, "All right, tell him I met you." His dresser, Howard's dresser, was a fellow called Bill, and he told me that when Howard was going around the golf course, he would sing before he hit the ball. Sing in as loud a voice as he could. That's all. Little anecdote. In the early 60s, the Conservative government was voted in, and things began to change fairly rapidly. There were strip clubs opened up in Soho, and things like it. There were things called betting shops. Betting was made legal, and actors used to go in there with earphones and get the message through other earphones from the track, and then they would relay this to the betting stores all over London. This was quite a thing. I was there at one time doing my bit. I met some very interesting characters, including friends of Peter O'Toole. They were sitting broadcasting the races to the betting shops, and everything started loosening up, as I mentioned before. There were not a lot of strip clubs. There wasn't a lot of scandalous activity going on, but Whiskey A Go-Go and all of these things opened up in an area called Soho, which was very interesting at the time, surrounded by theatres and Greek Street, all that area. That I knew that area so well, the west end of London, Piccadilly. I lived between Piccadilly and Leicester Square and Trafalgar Square, right in the heart of London for 4 years. My landlady was the wardrobe woman at the Old Vic, where I had met her. That was in the beginning of the late 1950s. And the man who lived below me was called John Kay, and he had invented television with Logie Baird, a man called Logie Baird. There were two Scots, and when he died, I phoned up several doctors. He had one of these quick cancers. Nobody would come to him because he did not believe in doctors. He was not registered, and the police carried him out in a box, and he was buried in the pauper's grave. He had £1,000 in the bank, which was inherited by a friend from Little Twittering in Sussex, who had never even heard of him. And that was John Kay. He was also a consultant engineer who rebuilt the Waterloo Bridge after the war. It had been bombed heavily during the war. And nobody knows about him until I talk about him. And I'm talking about him now. In 1968, I know I keep coming back to that, but in that year I think also I was doing tests with Peter Hall, now Sir Peter Hall, the great stage director. He was directing this film called 3 into 2 Won't Go, Rod Steiger and Claire Bloom. And Judy Geeson was the co-star. She was 19. That's when I met Judy Geeson. Later on in Hollywood, in the Mayfair supermarket up in Franklin, I happened to run into her several years ago, and I talked about that time, and we were lined up to pay our bill, and I'd forgotten something, so I shouted to her. I said, "Judy, what was that film you made in London with John Wayne and Richard Attenborough?" She said, "Brannigan." Brannigan is the title of a film that Judy Geeson made in London with John Wayne. And when I met her in the supermarket, I had forgotten the title. So I shouted to her in the next line. We were waiting to pay our check. I said, "Judy, what was the film you made in London with John Wayne?" And that took everybody's attention. Every head swiveled towards her. She said, "Brannigan." In the 1960s, there was a phenomenon of redesigned Western movies, came from Spain and Italy, starring Lee Van Cleef, Aldous Umbrell, Anthony Stephan, Giuliano Gemma, Franco Nero, Clint Eastwood. The directors were Ferdinando Baldi, Sergio Corbucci, Michel Lupo, Enzo Castellari, Sergio Leone. And the composers were Ennio Morricone, Nino Rota, and Bruno Nicolai. Very fast-moving, very action-full, very dynamic. They changed the face of a great deal of filmmaking, especially westerns. Similarly, it was a European recreation of the Secret Agent movie with their own heroes. OSS 117, 077, 3S3, Z55, Upper 7, with Kerwin Matthews, Richard Harrison, George Ardison, Ken Clark, Brad Harris, and Tony Kendall, who played the part of Agent Joe Walker. The women were Silva Kushina and Marisa Mell. This is Eunice Gayson. She was the first woman to appear in Dr. No, the first Bond film. I worked on The Sound of Music stage for 3 years, and Eunice played the Baroness, so I knew her very well. This is an actress who played a half Chinese girl, also in Dr. No, but she was absolutely English. This is a Walter PKK, as I recall. In one of the Bond films, Q tells him that it's likely to jam, so they give him another kind of gun. This is Sean Connery with Noel Coward, who lived in Jamaica at the time. This is Joseph Wiseman, one of the greatest American character actors, as Dr. No, and he's the one who told Bond that if he didn't join him, he was just another stupid policeman. This is Robert Shaw with blonde hair. He actually had very black hair, and I used to go to the Players Club, and in the basement there was an actor's coffee shop. Connery sometimes was there, Michael Caine, everybody out of work at that time. I was working on Beauty and the Beast, which was being put on in the stage. Robert Shaw was the only one of the famous people, or to become famous, who saw that I was new. So every time I went in, he would wave and shake hands and say a few words. A very nice man. This is Daniela Bianchi, who played the heroine in From Russia with Love. Very beautiful. This is George Lazenby, who played the lead in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I met him in the studio because he was testing with another actor named John Richardson. And so that's exactly how I met him. He only was in one Bond film. So I wish John, you're in the shadow again. Lazenby worked on commercials before, and he was quite well known in commercials. As a matter of fact, he played someone getting out of a car, walking through a country village with a large Cadbury's chocolate on his shoulder, and apparently when the film opened and he walked on the screen, the audience shouted, "Big Cadby!" Diana Rigg. She had some stage experience before she went into the Avengers, and consequently co-starred on Her Majesty's Secret Service. Later on she toured with Keith Michelle and came to New York with Abelard and Eloise. There were 3 big fight set pieces in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with an excellent chase sequence in the snow. Some people actually think this is the best of all the Bond films. The title theme was instrumental, and the film had a song by Louis Armstrong, sung by him. We have all the time in the world. Blofeld, the villain from Spectre, was played by Donald Pleasance, Telly Savalas, and Charles Gray. Donald Pleasance was probably one of the most sinister. Charles Gray was a superb actor, and Telly Savalas was really a kind of amiable Blofeld. He never struck me as being sinister at all, but he was good. Donald Pleasance in You Only Live Twice may well have been the best. Harry Black and the Tiger, Stuart Granger and Barbara Rush. Stuart Granger was always very nice to me. Apparently a lot of people didn't like him, and he was somewhat discontent. I happened to meet Barbara Rush in Hollywood around 1973, and I said, I wonder why Stuart Granger was that way. She said, yes, nothing ever pleased him. Nothing ever seemed to please him. I remember his gun bearer, i.s.johar, saying to me one morning, Mr. Stuart Granger, what a difficult fellow. Nothing ever pleases him. By the way, i.s.johar later appeared in Lawrence of Arabia. He's the man that Lawrence had to shoot because he had shot one of Anthony Quinn's tribal men. I worked on 2 of the Avengers, but not with Diana Rigg. It was a Canadian girl called Linda Thorson. The location was out in a remote, abandoned railway station, and we were there for several days. The horses were badly treated. I had to tell the young girl in charge of them to get them away from the rails. They were put down by the rails. The rails were rusty, and the horses were grazing their fetlocks. And people kept giving them sugar. So I had to make a public announcement, don't give any more sugar to the horses. They're getting very agitated. It was a very, very hot day. And reminded me of Vincent Price. He was very concerned about the horses. Now we come to Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was the author of Sherlock Holmes, although a detective story had already been written sometime before by Edgar Allan Poe. Sherlock Holmes starred Basil Rathbone in 2 big 20th century Fox films, The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Then, during the Second War, Rathbone signed a contract with Universal. They made a series of modern Sherlock Holmes. He was fighting the Nazis and so on and so forth. Bulldog Drummond, another famous detective, books written in 1910, were played, the character was played by Richard Johnson in the 60s. Prior to that, in the 1930s, Ronald Colman was Bulldog Drummond. But Richard Johnson was not called Bulldog, too nationalistic. He was in 2 very good films, and he was described by someone I knew as a high-class Sean Connery. In 1948, Winston Churchill came to the Congress and made the memorable speech about an iron curtain that's fallen across Europe. That gave birth to what became the Cold War, and that set the pattern for James Bond. So for much of the time he was fighting the Soviets, but not really the Soviets. It was a secret Spectre plot that was always plotting to take over the world. Can't think of it. The creator of James Bond, Ian Fleming, worked in the Secret Service during the Second War, and before that he was actually in Archangel in the trials of the White Russians back in, this would be 1920. The man who established the Secret Service for the British, the first Secret Service ever organized in the 1600s, was John Dee, who was the astrologer for Queen Elizabeth I, and his secret code name was 007. John Dee, with a friend of his who was a psychic, traveled to the Roman Colosseum in the 1600s, and apparently the two of them stood at night and conjured up a flight of very strange looking angelic forms that actually had something like bat's wings. They were very dark, and they were circling around the Colosseum. So history tells us. There is a famous engraving of that very scene, and he is the man who established the first Secret Service. The occult was very much employed within the Secret Service. During the war, Winston Churchill had astrologers trying to figure out something about Hitler. Hitler had his own astrologers trying to figure out the reverse. So the CIA was trained by the Nazis and MI6, British Secret Service. And the story is, true or not, that a lot of occultism is connected with the CIA. I cannot verify that. Another detective, on a somewhat lower level, kind of civil servant type, was Harry Palmer. Michael Caine was the star. A Press File, Funeral in Berlin, and $1 Billion Brain, the first major film directed by Ken Russell, with stupendous visuals. Len Deaton was actually the associate producer on a film I worked on, Oh, What a Lovely War, Richard Attenborough's first film as director. And Len had to put his money in something because he was being taxed 90% by the government. He was very, very rich. He really didn't know about filmmaking, but came and approved one or two sets and then disappeared back to the place where he was living. Another actor who could have played James Bond was Stanley Baker. He died prematurely at the age of 48. He was descended from Welsh miners, and I believe he had the black lung disease. There was one possible James Bond type, an actor from Australia, Rod Taylor. He never made a James Bond film, but he played Boise Oakes in The Liquidator in London, and in another film called The High Commissioner. He was a detective in that. Rod Taylor, an Australian actor who came to the States. He played in Dark of the Sun, sometimes called The Mercenaries, with Jim Brown and Yvette Mimieux. That was about a mercenary sent to the Belgian Congo in the 1960s to rescue the inhabitants of a small town and bring back a cachet of diamonds from the local bank. It's one of Rod Taylor's best films, with a thrilling jeep chase through the jungle. Two social movies made in England at the time were To Serve with Love, Sidney Poitier, Judy Jason, and Lulu, who sang the title song, which was a big hit, about a black teacher who came to a low-class London school where the kids were all antagonistic towards him, and he finally won them over. It was done very well, without any false sentiment at all, and written and directed by James Clavell, his first film. He's the famous author of Shogun, King Rat, and other big best-selling books. That was To Serve with Love. The other film was The Family Way with John Mills, from a play called All in Good Time. It's about a young couple, just married, moved in with their in-laws, and they have sexual problems. Doesn't sound much, but it was extremely well done, and the ending was very, very moving. Made by the twins, the Bolting twins. And one of them, at the age of 56, married Haley Mills, who at the time was 18 years old. That was The Family Way, well worth seeing. A friend of mine was associate producer on the film Help, and through him I met all of the Beatles. I became friendly with John Lennon, who used to drive me around London. He and I had known a woman who was an extra, and she had mysteriously disappeared. And he was convinced that she had been murdered and was buried in her backyard. And on rainy nights he used to drive me out to the location, and we had all kinds of strange adventures, walking through rain, he in a 300-pound suit, that's in terms of money. And nothing ever came of it, because her husband had gone to Switzerland, and the whole thing just disintegrated, but he was crazy about proving that murder had been committed. There's a scene in Help where they live in adjoining houses, each goes into his different house, and when the camera comes over, there are no separation of walls. There's a sunken part of the area. That was the place where I met the Beatles. And John Lennon and I were the two that got on better. I met Tyrone Power in Canada in 1953 when he was playing in The Dark Is Light Enough. That was a stage play. I then met him again in London, and I was friendly with him and this lady, whose name is Katie Boyle. She was the best known person in Europe because of the European television. She was born the Princess Francavilla in Italy, but as you see, she looked much more Irish than Italian. And she was very famous. She finally married the man who kept the mousetrap running for 40 years in London, Peter Saunders. So now she's Lady Saunders. This was Katie Boyle as the host of her own television show, BBC London, in 1961. This is Katie Boyle in later time. This is Katie Boyle. Recently, she wrote to me and said, this little dog she saved from being put in a plastic bag and thrown into the River Thames. And on the lower level, you'll see her looking very elegant. That's Katie as she is today. This is the letter to me from Peter Saunders, Katie's husband. I asked him why he was so successful in 40 years of running the mousetrap in London. And as far as I know, the mousetrap today is still running. So he said, I didn't have any early spectacular successes. Any latter-day success I may have had is, I think, one, concentrating on one project at the time to the exclusion of all others, and two, noticing opportunities and taking advantage of them. One is no good without the other. Peter Saunders. In the family way, everything is resolved, and the couple go off on a real honeymoon. John Mills is sitting crying in the chair because the plot has told us that his son is not really his. He was fathered by his best friend, and his wife is holding his shoulder. In comes the younger son and said, "What's wrong, Dad?" And John Mills said, "It's life, lad, life. It might make you laugh at your age, but later on, it'll make you bloody cry."